Video.
So hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Kamil Duarte. I am a Stanford class of 2005 and the current president of Stanford Pride, the organization under Stanford Alumni Association focused on the LGBTQ plus community of alumni and also faculty, staff, and students. Today, we're going to be discussing an article that was written by our friend and co-host here, Kamil Aftyka, who's joining us from Poland. And that article was called Queerness and a New Enlightenment, that was published in the Stanford Daily in April, I believe, of this year. So thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned before I started the recording, given that we're a small group, I welcome folks to turn their videos on if they're comfortable with that. We are recording this. It's not being broadcast currently, but the thought would be that we would make it available at least to our membership and to the campus community at some point in the future. So be mindful of that. Generally speaking, regarding logistics, we had blocked the first half hour or so for Kamil and I to talk in conversation, and the second to be open to Q&A and discussion. But given that we're such a small group, please feel free to jump in at any point. So I'll talk a little bit more about myself and my background and interest in particular in this work. I don't know if I mentioned, I studied product design at Stanford because I was set to go work for Disney and design theme parks. But it so happened that I didn't pass out of my foreign language requirement through taking the AP Spanish exam in high school. And so I took sign language because my high school happened to have a lot of deaf people in it. And I already knew sign language, and I thought I would walk into the sign language class first quarter and just prove that I could speak it well enough. And the instructor would say, okay, you're good, go, I'll just give you an A and you'll be fine. Well, she had other ideas. She made me her TA, and I was her TA for 3 years, which then led me to pursue master's and PhD in linguistics, specifically sign language linguistics. And I'm now a sign language interpreter based in Washington, DC. Anyway, I say that because I've always been fascinated at historical linguistics and the use of language, particularly how we describe communities of people. And so Kamil's article fascinated me quite a lot. And it discusses, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, the uses of the words in particular, queer and gay, and what those mean historically and contextually to today. And so I'll ask Kamil to introduce himself and then to talk a little bit about the article. Kamil is a recent graduate of the university, having graduated just last month, or last week, I guess, at this point. So class of 2021, majored in philosophy, comes from Northern Poland, but is joining us from Warsaw today. And I'll turn it over to Kamil now to introduce himself. And we'll have some questions before he talks a little bit more about the article.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the invitation. I studied philosophy for my major, and I want to become a philosopher and write philosophical texts, although I would say that my interest in philosophy is maybe more avant-garde or niche compared to what is usually done in the philosophy departments at universities. I have a quite long and developed interest in well, also basic disciplines of philosophy, such as epistemology or philosophy of language, but also just history of philosophy, a lot of philosophy from the continent of Europe, German, French, Polish, also early British, early US philosophy. These are the kinds of currents and environments of thinking that did interest me. And like Kyle, I think I'm very much interested in the nature of language, and firstly, how language is a cultural production, and in that way, in a way, expresses various thoughts people have had throughout centuries, had in the past and have now, but also how, because of that, when we assimilate language, we are carriers of this great cultural progress that has happened. And also in this way, we often carry also some either bad or good ways of using the language in the past. And also language can, in ways, teach us things about various concepts. I think a lot about how different languages, just by the way they are organized and the words they use and their etymology, sometimes just make thinkers think in certain categories other than, or make think one in categories in a way that is easier compared to other language, to other languages. And so I do think that, well, in a way, in my philosophical thinking, a lot of work, a lot of ideas come from the reflection on language as well, and that is somewhat avant-garde, because usually in recent decades in philosophy, the trend, maybe it is changing in the 21st century, but throughout a lot of the 20th century, the trend was to think of philosophy as really construing and deducing and arguing about concepts, whereas the language we use to express it is really just a matter of tentative custom, something that does not really matter that much. You can just formally introduce any concept in any language you want, and the language you use, its artistic quality, its other qualities do not really matter for the truthful inquiry. So I stand somewhere outside of this tradition, as I think that that language and its historical use have tremendous impact also on how we think. So that's perhaps something that was foundational for, or made me interested particularly in this aspect of studying sexuality and such.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this has been an interesting last year. Can you give us a little bit of context into what your world was like, studying on campus and then eventually studying not on campus? I imagine as a senior, maybe that was a little easier, or how did that work? You're obviously 9 hours ahead of Stanford in time zones. So can you talk about your experience with being a student during COVID?
Yes, of course. Well, of course, in ways it was disappointing, because physical university is always better than virtual university. And I did miss the kinds of opportunities and gatherings that would happen in the fourth year of undergraduate years. But my experience wasn't very bad compared to, for instance, how others experienced the pandemic. I stayed for the first 3 months until early June in Stanford, on Stanford campus. And probably in retrospect, had I had a chance to decide once again, I would have left at the beginning, because it was probably the most difficult period, just because I think I have not really talked in person for more than a minute in the entire 3 months. So it was a little, so it was challenging in that sense. Although as a philosopher, I live in the ivory tower and so on, but in a way it was something that indeed turned out to be surprisingly difficult, especially after I really left Stanford and just started to think about how much I missed, how many things I missed while during those 3 months. But then I went to Poland, and I am here. I've been here for a year, over a year, and I studied both in fall, in winter, in spring at Stanford virtually, and the financial aid office was very generous to the financial aid recipients, and I was able to rent an apartment in Warsaw, just thanks to the fundings from the financial aid office. So it was very pleasant in many ways. Of course, virtual, tiring sometimes when having classes past midnight, my time zone, but overall it was a good experience. Not an experience that I could really justifiably complain about, at least not too much.
Yeah, and I for those of you who didn't see the announcement, the university is promising to hold an in-person commencement ceremony for the class of 2020. They obviously did something in person just a couple of weeks ago for class of 2021, but Kamil, I assume you were not able to go to campus for that.
No, unfortunately not. No,
Yeah.
I couldn't technically be there, but a lot of
Oh,
people
yeah.
did actually attend the commencement. Mostly those who were already in the US, but surprising numbers of people attended it, which is very promising. That things seem to be going back to normal.
Yeah, the class of 2005 had to have our dinner on the quad in Meyer Pavilion, the basketball court, because it was raining, and we thought we really missed out. And now we're eating our words. But okay, Kamil, I'll give you some time to talk about the article. Can you give us a rundown of what you've looked at in the article and how you feel that's relevant to how we talk about our community today?
Yes, of course. Well, so I think that the first thing that really interested me was so for first observation was that the ways we construe the discourse around sexuality and our community in English is very influential also in the world. It is that the case that, for instance, in my region of the world, the kinds of discussions, also academic studies in, for instance, queer and trans studies, they are all very, the ones from the English-speaking world are very influential. And a lot of words and terms that are being used are very directly used in, for instance, in Polish, in Slavic languages, and other small languages for most part. But they are very often just used as really direct translation. So it's not that word gay is translated as an equivalent, as for instance, joyful in Polish or in other languages. It just sounds the same way as it sounds in English. So it does sound like a relatively foreign word. Same with queer and similar words. And so I had a sense that very often this makes a lot of people feel that who would identify themselves as outside of the community, or even somewhat sympathetic but not really in it, to feel that there is something foreign and unpleasantly so in those words when they don't sound like words that come from the natural language we use every now and then. And actually, after the publication, now I recall a friend of mine from Turkey wrote to me and said, "Yes, well, it's exactly the same in Turkish. This is how it works there." And this made me also think that actually the historical meanings of the words gay and queer, that meant joyful, or that meant weird, respectively, are not something that maybe has to be completely forgotten when we are using those words nowadays, even if we are emphasizing the aspect of the reference to one's sexuality, one's emotional life, the feelings of one's heart. And the reason is, I think that, well, firstly, if we put the matters this way, then, well, we can find perhaps good ways of devising, finding nice, good words in non-English languages that could express a similar intention as do the words gay and queer in English, that have their own history of usage, and history not just that did not come to life just a few decades ago, and therefore they can be found in texts from 200 or 300 years ago, from great literary works, and in general have certain grounding and a sense of familiarity in the respective languages. But I also think this is an idea I wanted to express in this article, that if actually we use those words such as gay and queer and also think through them this older meaning, this can actually enrich and the usage of these words and make the meaning more also more familiar in English itself. Now, the important part here is to realize that that this aspect of this meaning that refers to sexuality is not something that can be forgotten or should be forgotten. And actually, I would say that to fully realize this, one actually needs to see that the words such as queer and gay became so apt for such general words became so apt for the expression of one's sexuality, because sexuality is a very important and very often defining element, one of the defining elements of one's not just one's sexual preferences, but also of one's emotional life, of one how experiences, feelings of how one's heart operates, of how one laughs. And therefore this, and I think that the prospect of the future use of the words such as gay and queer is a certain synthesis of the old and this newer meaning. I think that this is a very gay prospect for these words, because when they become so, once the synthesis becomes a reality, it will also make it just easier to use those words, for instance, by those who do not exactly feel open or ready to say that they are, for instance, gay or lesbian. I think that there is also this value in broadening and grounding the usage of such words in making them open to also those who are more on the side of less defined, fluid sexualities. And I think that the recent years show empirically that so little people in, for instance, my generation, I read headlines saying practically no males who identify as people who identify as males claim that they are 100% straight. Or this is a certain thing that I think is a reality, does happen. And by making the synthesis of meanings of the words, I think that also such people with more fluid, less defined sexualities, not 100% this or that, can also be more at home in finding right words for expression. This is maybe not an end. I suppose that I'm not saying that these words, these two particular words, must become the words for an expression of, say, fluid sexuality or some new forms of sexuality, but I think that they have this potential, and it is at least worth considering this potential in that way. So I think this will do, for at least for a brief introduction, not that brief, but an introduction. And I'll stop now and just see what questions you might have. And
yeah, wonderful. I think it's lovely to know that we're finally liberating straight men from the ravages of linguistic pressures to be.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I actually read yesterday a text claiming that, well, I mean, the reason why a lot of people stop saying that we are 100% straight is that a lot of young men are thinking through the term toxic masculinity. I mean, even the most straight identified men often just ask, well, I heard on the news, everyone is using this term toxic masculinity. Well, what does it mean? But the point of the article I read yesterday was that, well, actually, well, once one starts thinking about this and trying not to be toxically masculine, one also becomes less certain at saying that they are 100% straight. That's a certain a way of a certain implication of it.
Yeah. I was going to ask you how you refer to how you use the word gay in Polish, but you said it right. It's just a loan. It's a borrow of the English word gay, right? Yeah.
It's a borrow. Yes, it's been used for a few generations of people, for a few decades. So it is not a word that came to us just 10 years ago. The word queer as such, but it has a longer history, but it's still a very short history. And you usually say, for instance, when one says in English, "I am gay," this means, well, this can be both an adjective. This can also have a sense of a noun, but it is different. But it is different in Polish. When one says in Polish, "I am a gay," this is the only way of saying it in a way, and it's certainly a noun, and it certainly therefore essentializes this kind of identity, and add to it the fact that it is. It also sounds foreign as a word, and that makes the word really hard to use for many people.
I think you can do that in French too, right, Claude? You can say "c'est un gay," "il est gay." You can.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier because in French the word for joyful or gay is exactly the same word as English, except it's GAI instead of GAY. But the word has existed in the French language with exactly practically the same pronunciation, so that made it absolutely easier. It's not a calque from the English. It's a genuinely. It's not like in Spanish, where people in Mexico say when they want to say the gays, they say los gays, and there it's a borrowing, and it doesn't have anything to do with the word for joyful in Spanish. But in French, it was easier. So the word was adopted like completely naturally in French.
Yeah, Spanish has a couple of more pejorative words that I think people are trying to get around. So it makes sense to borrow the English, and since it's so accessible, like Kamil said, English certainly shapes the way that people all around the world think about concepts, just because it's so the media puts it all over the place. Alan, did you have a comment?
You're muted, Alan.
There we go. Yeah. I'm reminded of gender pronouns to the extent we're talking of an evolution. And to me, that's something that is generational. And I should inform Kamil, I speak as a person with history and law degrees from Stanford. So I bring those to my thought processes happily and disastrously sometimes, but nonetheless, that's where I come from. And I see the word fegera in my culture was just a term. A person would ask, "Oh, is he or is she fegeras?" And the answer would be, "Oh, yes." The way we use the word gay today. But it's become pejorative. It's become distasteful. It's become unhelpful. But it's become that in a generational sense. In my generation, and mind you, I've been out of undergraduate college for 58 years. In my generation, the word is perfectly acceptable derogatorily, perfectly acceptable. But I don't see younger people using or even knowing the word at all. And the same thing has happened with the word queer, and the same thing has happened with the word gay. Gay is fun because it's in so many operas and so many stories, and you just read it and sort of bump on it with a smile and read on. But I want to stress the generational aspect of what you're talking about. When you say that we're liberating, I think that was your word, Kyle. The liberating part is a liberation that does not happen right now. And one of the things that impresses me that if I go on the Stanford campus, I'm going to hear they, theirs, them. I'm going to hear things that I don't ever hear in my life. And the reasons that that's okay, there isn't any conflict, is that the college students lead the way in the evolution of our society in many respects. But don't try to tell any of the 15 people with whom I live, the average age of which is 87, that those things make any sense. Why would they want to do that? Who are they? They have no sense. So I just would like to color what you're saying by suggesting that the evolution of the words that you've described is something that is generational. And I think that, frankly, as a historian and a lawyer, is a good thing. I know that in the late 80s and 90s, when we told HIV patients that don't worry, there will be a cure someday, and then they died, it wasn't a very helpful response. And therefore, I see students who are very angry that we will not use pronouns or words like queer or fegala. We will not use the words that they want. But the reality is that and the evolution in language, and I hope you can confirm or destroy this thought, the evolution in language takes time. And it takes time, and I think it's often generational. I'm going to leave it at that. I do think that the same discussion we're having today could be a discussion about gender pronouns, because that's the same pathway, the same journey that our English language has taken, except that it has more of a challenge. And it has more of a challenge when you look at it as an identity, because it is so in conflict with existing cultural mores in our culture. And to the extent it stands alone, it stands to fail. And only time will tell, only time will tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. You've actually teed up my portion of the discussion quite nicely. I'll have to send you some, I'll Venmo you. I hope that's not too much. I'm gonna share some, share my screen here. So
while you do that, I was just curious, because I don't know the Polish language at all, but I have some rudiments of Russian. And in Russian, in most sentences, I mean, you don't have pronouns really. So you don't say he or she at the beginning, you just start with the verb. So you don't say he, I don't know. I mean, it's the use of pronouns is different. So is the use of he, she, or they as marked in Polish as it is in English, and you really have to choose a pronoun, or?
Yes, so actually one has to, although in different ways. So it is true that, for instance, in Polish as well, there is no need to start with, when you introduce a verb, to start from he or she. And so actually, when one does it, it is understood as a calque from English, because English is so popular. But you do have to usually to introduce, to transform a verb, add a suffix to a verb that indicates gender. So it is effectively the same. In the case of verbs, for instance, there are also, for instance, nouns and some adjectives that do have a gender as well attached to them, but often, they are abstract. Also, this applies to abstract words. So, for instance, words such as knowledge. Knowledge is she, and so is philosophy. But for instance, I don't know. There are other words that are masculine, and some are neuter, neutral, non-gender. So there are other complexities, I suppose. But in a way, there's also a gender pronoun in Polish. It just manifests itself in different ways, in other ways.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to use some web tools to actually respond to what Alan brought up. So I'm coming back to my linguistics roots, and so what you're seeing here is Google Books Ngram viewer. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Google Books project, it's a large project for Google to basically scan every book that ever existed, if they can manage to do that. But that, and to turn that into readable text, and then to understand, to do their search stuff that Google does on what's been published. So this is the tool. If you go to books.google.com/ngrams, this is the page that you get to, and you can search for different things that appear in published works. So you'll always see this at the very beginning. It shows you the prevalence of three phrases: Albert Einstein, Sherlock Holmes, and Frankenstein. And obviously Albert Einstein doesn't get any prevalence until, I don't know, 1915 or so, when he's 40, 45 years old and starting to publish things. And before that, he's not even been born, or he hasn't published anything yet. So then you can see him rise in popularity in relation to all the other words in the database. And the same thing with Sherlock Holmes and Frankenstein. So it's a free, publicly available tool if you ever have any curiosity on how we use language. So here's the same type of graph, but using the words queer, gay, and LGBT. And as Alan alluded to, you see the word gay used in literature all the time, but it had a very different meaning. And you can see that over time, it actually decreased in meaning quite a lot until the late 1970s or so, when it picked back up again. And now we're actually to a point where the word gay is appearing in literature as much as it did back in the mid 1800s. And the same is true with queer, having hit a low in right about 1980, and then LGBT obviously is a newer term that's picked up steadily since the late 1990s. We can wonder, what does this hump look like in gay? And so if you ever want to look at that, you can, down at the bottom, it'll show you your search terms and then give you some time ranges. These I guess these are just arbitrary time ranges that Google decides for you. But if you look at the mid 1800s, which seems to be where we had our big hump, you'll actually see that gay is the name of an author, which must have been a very popular author at the time.
Well, the other thing, Cal, is at the time, gay was not used in the sense of homosexual. Gay was used in you would say, I think there's some song lyrics in a musical or something like that about happy and gay.
Right.
So that earlier high incidence of the word gay probably had nothing to do with sexuality. So that you have to be careful about synonyms and homonyms, because or words that have been the acception of the word has changed over time. That can be quite misleading in that case.
Exactly. So I'm going to pop over to this is the corpus of historical American English. This is a part of a collection of corpora of English, of the English language, not just American, but also British English. It is housed at BYU, so we'll thank them for their contribution to today's effort, and we can discuss their involvement later. But here you can actually see, so I've run this is called collocates. So basically, like when you find the word gay in the corpus, what words appear within 4 words on either side of the word gay? So at the top, you can see the most popular word to appear on either side of the word gay within the 4 words preceding or after is the word lesbian, such as in the phrase gay and lesbian rights or whatever. Gay and also seems to appear quite closely to gay in and of itself. You see gay rights and gay marriage. So that's the top 4. Now, if you look across the top here, you can see that this is a timeline. It's a decade-based timeline of the entries. And it gets most prevalent here on the right-hand side, meaning in the last 20, 30 years that those words have begun to appear next to the word gay. And then the next 7 entries are things like bright, flowers, laugh, grave, colors, laughter, and gallant. So these are clearly what you're talking about, right, Claude? These are words that are affiliated with a very different meaning of the word gay. And those appear in the 1800s for the most part, right, in that entire century. And then the next one is bisexual. Again, very highly correlated to modern times and didn't appear anywhere else in the corpus in the 1800s. So this is a tool that's a little more academic in its use. It's not as straightforward as the Google tool, but it shows us how our language is changing over time.
The question
this doesn't
here,
yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. A question here would be whether the meaning of gay that is from lines 5 to lines 11, if that meaning has disappeared from the language, as shown by the colors becoming almost all white towards the right of your chart, because the word gay started meaning homosexual, and people who were using the word gay in the sense of happy, joyful, etc., stopped using it to avoid ambiguity, or because they were unhappy that the word had been co-opted by our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same with queer,
I'd like
right?
to suggest to you that the 1940 decade is a decade of war and misery and unhappiness and somewhat of recovery. And there are probably, that explains to some extent the use of gay in the flower brilliant colors, laughter, laugh sense. And I have the same comment about this, the decade of the 1950s. These are the anti-communist things where you were hauled in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee if you were using words like gay, sodomy, and the like. So I would doubt at that time that that's a word that you would choose to use. Maybe, this is pure speculation, maybe people were using underground words to communicate to each other, but the concept of a person who they then described as a homosexual or gay was very distasteful in those 2 decades.
Yeah, and what this of course doesn't tell us, just from this view of the corpus, is, are people using the word gay to mean a homosexual, and are they using it in a pejorative sense rather than, is this a positive way to describe somebody? We don't see that, we don't know that. Here's another view. This again is of the Google Books project. Now this one is coupled words, so gay and then something else, which you can see here on the left-hand side. So gay men, gay people, gay community, gay rights, versus gay world. Kamil and I were talking about this one, gay world, which apparently was wildly popular to talk about in the early 1850s, and then almost died, but unlike the other collocates, actually came back a little bit in the late 20th century, early 21st century. I don't know that I've heard gay world much, but I guess it's out there.
But it's probably again in a completely different meaning.
Oh yeah.
It came back.
And we could talk about reclamation. I mean, you know, obviously the community right now is reclaiming queer in a lot of ways, and using that to describe ourselves. So I can share these links afterward.
What do you mean by community, Kyle?
I guess I mean people who would identify with, well, maybe that's, I don't know, unpack that one.
I'm not attacking.
Are you suggesting there isn't one?
Yesterday with 4 people who were my age. And I'd be surprised to hear the words that you hear on campus. They're just not there. They have different lives. They're not sexually oriented. They're retirement oriented. They're opera oriented. They're activity oriented and hopefully health oriented. But most of these words didn't appear in our luncheon discussion, although everybody knew who everybody was, and none of them were partnered. Or they're partnered, but not with the people who are at the lunch. So that's what I wonder. That little community is probably multiplied to a community of 700 or 800 people who belong to the Prime Timers organization in Palm Springs. Those are all old farts, and all of them also probably, or my experience is that events with them were not as sexual orientation focused as other communities are. So that's the only reason I raised it.
Yeah. I obviously live in Washington, D.C., and I'm in my late 30s. And yeah. And that's, you know, that's, yeah, I'm with you. One more that I wanted to share with you before I close the screen here. This is the use of transgender versus transsexual, and you can see, oh, this actually got exploded. Let's see if I can do it. So there's, oh no, what did I do here? Let me try doing this again. There we go. That's put together. So you can see that transsexual was more popular than transgender until about the late 1990s, and then transgender really picked up steam. So anyway, some cool free tools to take a look at how we use language. And, yeah. Any other thoughts on today. It's been nice to be in conversation with you all.
I think we have
Yeah.
struggled. We've struggled in the older generations to find a word that describes that entire group or community of transsexual, transgender, all the things that have to do with the sexual identities. We now say there are a multitude of sexual identities. I think because we're so used to a culture, we're hesitant to go and figure out how to address this and what to call it. And I think that what I see is we say transgender. And what we mean is we don't really know what we're saying, but we know what we're not saying. That's not very polite, but I think that's what's happening.
I'd be wrong, but I also think that a third word that is maybe even becoming more popular is just trans people, for instance, as it does not include the word gender, which already has an assumption that there is that one must have some kind of gender. So I suppose there's also this tendency there to go for a word that has more vagueness, but because of that, it's also not limiting with some categories that make assumptions. And this is why I was, for instance, in my text, so interested in the words gay and queer, because I think that taken also together with their historical meaning and their generality, they have a lot of potential to be labels, to be, if we need labels or words that do describe something that can capture a lot of essential things of everyone who, for instance, wants to go outside of the heteronormativity and such. So that's this. So this is where these kinds of thoughts come from also.
It would be interesting in that respect to see how the word transvestite was used extensively at some point and probably has disappeared largely, because that was a word about a behavior, not about an identity. And so it was a way for people to the word cross-dresser was used also extensively at some point and has probably disappeared at the point where people realized that this was no longer just a particular way for people to behave, but it was really a different thing. It was that their identity was transgender or transsexual. Not, it didn't have anything to do particularly with how, men wearing dresses or women wearing pants.
There you go, Claude. The problem with trans is, unfortunately, Google treats it as a modifier, and so you get all these things.
You're going to have a lot of you're going to have transatlantic and things like that.
Yeah, here's an example of what trans splicing and recombination in petunia mitochondria comes up as one. So that's that's not what we're talking about, obviously.
These are gay flowers.
Yeah. But yeah, so transvestite never became more popular than transsexual in their corpus. Yeah, and crossdresser was never very, very popular at all, it seems.
I mean, it would have been used in very few instances, maybe in some newspaper articles.
I also, if I recall correctly, the word transvestite was coined in German by, who was it? I think it was, there was this famous sexuologist, Magnus Hirschfeld. I forget now so it might be just a Freudian slip or something, but I think this is the name of the sexuologist who was very progressive at the time of the Weimar Republic. Then, of course, his institute was destroyed during the Nazi era. But he was, I think, the one to coin the term transvestite, and this might mean that for instance, German or other languages, there would be a different history of usage. Maybe it didn't get through that much to the English world for the first decades after the coinage. So that's also a little addition to it.
Is anyone studying the the disappearance or the perseverance of the pejorative terms, whether basically with greater awareness and in many cases greater acceptance, the pejorative names are maybe disappearing from the language, hopefully. Is that a study that anyone is doing?
Not that I know of. There is a linguist who did his PhD at Stanford. His name is escaping me. He's now at the University of Colorado. He also was a drag performer in San Francisco and was looking specifically at the use of language within drag circles. But specifically, his PhD was on the use of language in the LGBTQ community. But I don't know specifically if people are looking at, the pejorative words.
It would be interesting to see if, like, maricon in Spanish or pede in French, or etc., are words that are being less used because now people are more comfortable, including straight people, are more comfortable about using the neutral or the descriptive terms, as opposed to having to use a pejorative term in order to establish with their buddies that they were straight, which I think was a phenomenon at some point. If you were in a group of toxic, straight males, like a jock group or whatever, you had to use a pejorative term, otherwise your friends might think you were too sympathetic to gays. So that phenomenon should be disappearing, and it would be interesting to trace it through language.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm hanging out with my friends and we're in a safe space, we might use the word fag, but that's not something I would use in front of my mom or family, right? But that's common in communities of people who share some identity.
That's the reclamation stuff. Is like, there are words that I can use that, because I'm using them, I've established that I'm not using them offensively, but no one else has the right to say that to me, because from them, and you have exactly the same thing to name the elephant in the room with the N-word in the Black community.
Yeah.
I would suspect that if there were a study, it would consider whether the extent to which LGBT people has been accepted in a general society, that people are upset when they hear the words used like faggot, or even these days fega. And I think there's a defense that exists in a lot of people, straight people, that there wasn't previously. I'd like to, and I do hear LGBT people using words like faggot more openly, just as they evolved to use the word queer, first humorously and now rather proudly. I wonder what the experience is amongst the younger generation. Whether you see, Kyle, a more general hesitation in the workplace and the social place to use those sorts of words. I don't hear them here because people can't talk.
Yeah, I'm going to share an ad that's gotten some attention on social media recently, which was by Bud Light, which and it's got a GLAAD logo on it, right? So Bud Light thought, oh, no worries, we can put this. Let's grab beers tonight, Queens, and it flopped. It totally flopped. Like, we're not there's no creative at Bud Light who's a part of who's a gay person putting this out there. This is like, oh, you want me to buy your beer? Okay, cool. I think people are reclaiming it. That people are reclaiming queer. In the deaf community, people are reclaiming this sign for gay rather than spelling G-A-Y. This was seen as offensive, somewhat sexual, being close to the mouth, and so people just started spelling G-A-Y. They were like, "No, we don't have a better sign." So, but now people are reclaiming this, and I think that happens. I don't think fag or faggot are mainstream reclamation like queer is, but
It's so interesting. I work with all these medical students who really love the word queer. Like they really have reclaimed it, and it makes a lot of the faculty members kind of antsy. We just wrote a course on taking care of LGBTQ plus patients, which actually I'll put in the chat. You're all welcome to see it. It's free and open and access and such. But we have a vocabulary section where we highlight that, it was once a pejorative term that has been reclaimed, because it's trying to teach faculty members how to teach this content.
And for those of you who don't know, Mike is a new Stanford Pride board member and is on faculty at Stanford Medicine, Emergency Medicine.
Nice to meet
and
you
has
all.
been,
sorry I was late for this call.
No worries. Mike has been part of, we featured a study for the last couple of months in the e-newsletter that Mike's a part of there that's looking at LGBTQ health in particular. So.
Nice to meet you all.
I will maybe just add a little thing about reclamation. It seems to me that some of the words have a potential to stay with us longer, and some I think that will be used within the communities only for insofar as they are also used pejoratively outside of the communities. I think that the words such as fag or faggot will probably be more temporary until they stop being used widely outside, because they of course, this is my linguistic intuition, an intuition of a person to whom English is a second language, but it seems that the words such as fag or faggot have sound more colloquial, vulgar, and less pleasant perhaps than the as Kyle noticed, more popular still words such as gay or queer. And it seems, yes, that also the word queer, I think it has this value because it tended to have a pejorative meaning, but I think that this general meaning as just weird, unusual, is not a meaning. Is a meaning that will stop being this general meaning. I think will stop being pejorative, also outside of the discussions of sexuality, just overall, as in the discourses in which we speak about normalcy and the problem with the concept of normalcy. In my article, I write that, in fact, I invite a reader to conduct an exercise of trying to actually stop using the word weird and like words, because when we say something is weird, we might be just bringing in some irrational sense of repulsion that doesn't really have much ground. It's just comes from a certain habit of just not being used to something that we call weird. But if we call something weird and this is justified, then usually this is weird not just per se, but because, for instance, it is also just something very bad. Like, for instance, when we talk about some crime and we say, oh, or for instance, we watch a movie about a criminal and we say, well, the habits of that person are very weird. It's not just because they're weird as such, but because we sense that there is something really bad in that serial killer, for instance. So usually when we use word weird for a good reason, we could also substitute it for something perhaps else, such as bad. And in that way, I think that as a matter of exercise, it is quite easy to see that the words like queer in the old sense and weird and associated words are not really something that has to be used. And that I think, or if it is to be used, then precisely in a way that is subversive and that speaks no to some superstitions about what normalcy is and so on. So that word, because it also doesn't have, I think, phonetic and other unpleasant, doesn't bring unpleasant sensations as much as for instance, words such as fag. I think it can stay with us also when no one really uses the word such as fag in the pejorative sense, which will happen very soon.
I'm grateful that in the communities that are evolving, there's less pejorative language because they're becoming more and more aware of the people around them. It's certainly true in gymnasiums. It's certainly true in professional athletics in the locker room. You just have to be careful. And that's enough motivation for me to get rid of words. What is it like in the medical school? Does it reflect that? Michael, can you hear me?
Say that one more, oops, say that one more time. I just did the wrong thing with my video. Can you say that one more time?
I think Alan was asking, do you feel like in the medical field that people are becoming more aware of queer people, LGBTQ people, and therefore they are changing their language?
No, I don't. I think that I think I work with a lot of really nice, well-intentioned, very smart physicians who are compassionate and want to take care of their patients the right way, and they were never trained in how to use language properly. And if nothing else, my message to them when I'm doing training sessions is always ask the patient how they'd like to be addressed and follow their lead. And this goes for pronouns, it goes for various identities, it goes for anatomy. When you're doing exams, people refer to their anatomy differently. You know, to do trauma-informed pelvic exams, for instance, requires people to use language they've never been trained to use before. So anyway, so I think, no, I wish we were, is the short answer, but you know, at least people are aware enough now that you know, you should work with your patient to figure out how they would like to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. I'll add to that I'm a member of Kaiser Permanente, is my health organization, and they sent out a reminder to patients to fill out. We have different questionnaires that they send us all the time. Did you get a COVID shot? Yeah, great. Fill out this questionnaire. And I saw one that I'd never seen before that asks, what are your preferred pronouns? Do you identify as trans? Are you interested in gender confirmation care? Blah, blah, blah. I was floored that, you know, my healthcare provider was in touch with, you know, with how I want to be addressed and how I want to receive care in that way. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like it's gonna take some folks to shake things up, and it's probably gonna be the younger generations making some decisions that other people don't agree with. But we'll see that shift over time that we saw in the corpus data, and hopefully, as Kamil said, we won't hear your fag as a pejorative anymore. And we'll either decide that it just needs to be retired or we'll reclaim it. And that's how language works. So I want to thank Kamil for joining us today. I know it's late in Poland, so thank you for your time this evening there. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us and our community through your article and through today's event.
It was a pleasure, thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. If you'd like to get in touch with Kamil, you can email me and I'll forward your info along. So that's info@stanfordpride.org. Thank you all for joining us today and hope you have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.
Thank you for organizing.
Thanks, it was super interesting. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kamil.